Okay, so we're moving today from Old English literature, from Anglo-Saxon literature to Middle English literature. So we're, firmly in what we call sort of like high medieval England by this point. So do you guys have any questions about anything before we start?
How do you pronounce the queen's name?
Well, Herodotus would be my best guess.
That's how I figured you pronounced it.
Uh-huh.
I wasn't sure. I didn't want to mispronounce it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. What it is a kind of Anglo-Frenchified version of the Greek name Eurydice. And Orfeo is, of course, Orpheus. How familiar are you guys with the Orpheus myth? Okay, so what's the basic outline of the Orpheus story?
Orpheus goes to the underworld to retrieve Eurydice,
Uh-huh.
and he's told you can have her back, but don't look back on your way out. And on the way out, he looks back, and she gets sent back.
Yeah, and what's special about Orpheus? How is it that he's able to win Eurydice back?
With his harp.
Yeah, he is. I mean, he's the greatest musician who's ever lived, right? And so, by with the playing of his harp moves the gods of the underworld to tears, and as such, they will grant him that one request, right? But of course, he ignores the conditions placed on him, and then loses what he fought so hard to gain. How is this narrative different from the Greek myth?
He manages to take her back.
Yeah.
Really.
On the one hand, we get the happy ending, yeah. Orfeo and Eurydice actually do make it home together. What else is different here? Is Eurydice actually dead? Yeah, what happens to her instead?
She gets taken to fairy.
Yeah, she's kidnapped by the king of the fairies, right? And placed in that weird gallery of people. That we'll talk about that for sure, right? But the other difference here is that Herodotus isn't actually dead, at least not in the conventional sense. So was there anything that you guys thought was especially weird or interesting, like apart from the gallery of people? What else did you guys find like interesting or weird about this poem?
At the beginning, I'm not sure if I read it correctly, but
Okay.
Was she suicidal? Because she, where was it?
You're looking for, I think on page 172, around line 78.
She starts to tear at herself.
Yeah, there's this self-mutilation scene, right? Yeah, she wakes up after this dream and she starts tearing at her flesh and her clothes, right? And suddenly they heard her wake and cry and grievous clamor make. She writhed with limb, her hands she wrung, she tore her face till blood there sprung, her raiment rich in pieces rent, then sudden out of mind she went.
She's like crazy.
Yeah, the vision she's been shown drives her out of her mind, right? And she does violence to herself. I think some of what's going on here, what do I think about what's going on here? I'm not really sure of the purpose of the self-mutilation, right? I'm not really sure exactly why this happens or why this matters, because she's going to be taken whole and intact into the fairy realm, right? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's just contrived. She's self-mutilating herself, yet at the end it's just happily ever after, as if it never mattered because he just
Yeah.
gets his wife back and everything's fine.
Uh-huh.
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I guess 12th, 11th century writing didn't necessarily care. I
think
believe
she was-
that.
She was just driven mad by the vision, and her brain couldn't process it, so she just reacted
Mhm.
violently. That's coming from the psych major.
Well, and I think also this might also have something to do with the Fairy King's gallery of people, right? Actually, this might not be a bad time to go and look at that. Like, in a lot of ways, this is the most interesting part of the poem. If we look on page 182, bottom of the page here, right? Then he began to gaze about, and saw within the walls a rout of folk that were thither drawn below, and mourned as dead, but were not so. For some there stood who had no head, and some nor arms nor feet, some bled, and through their bodies wounds were set, and some were strangled as they ate, and some lay raving, chained and bound, and some in water had been drowned. And some were withered in the fire, and some on horse in war's attire, and wives lay there in their childbed, and mad were some, and some were dead. And passing many there lay beside, as though they slept at quiet noontide. Thus in the world was each one caught, and thither by fairy magic brought. There too he saw his own sweet wife, Queen Eurydice, his joy in life, asleep beneath a grafted tree. By her attire he knew 'twas she. Even though last time he saw her clothed, right, she was tearing at her clothes, and they were all bloody. So what do we notice about all of these people in the Fairy King's collection?
They're all in different states of mortality.
Yeah, they're all...
And nothing's been changed about them since they've been brought to Fairy. They were brought the way they
Mhm.
were caught.
Yeah, and they're all kind of like frozen at a moment of death, right? Right, it starts with, folk that were thither drawn below and mourned as dead, but were not so. So he makes the point, right, that these people are still alive, but they're captured at the point of death. So it kind of like eternally dying, right?
Kind of like limbo.
Yeah, they're caught in what we call a liminal moment. Are you guys familiar with this term liminal at all?
Kind
Okay, you might remember this actually. I think we talked about this in World War. Do you remember anything about what liminal means, Ashley?
Unchanging, untouched from outside events. Oh gosh.
Not quite. It's okay. It's been a while. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard the word. I've read
Yeah.
the word.
So liminal is actually a word that comes into literary criticism through anthropology. And it's used by anthropologists to describe the point in, like, say, an initiation ritual, when the participant is still involved in the ritual and hasn't completed it yet. So they've moved on from the state they were in before the ritual, but have not yet entered the state they'll be in after, right? So, like, say, a boy who is going through his bar mitzvah, right? He's a boy at the beginning and a man at the end of it. But in between, while the ceremony is still going on, he's kind of in this phase where he is both and neither, right? That's what it means to be liminal. Liminal refers to a kind of in-between state. Where you're somehow neither one thing nor another, but also both. It comes from, the word is taken from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. So when you're in a liminal space, you are on the threshold. Right? You're hovering in the doorway. Now I think that this is particularly important when we think about where Herodes was when she fell asleep. What did she fall asleep under?
A grafted tree.
A grafted tree, yes. That's important. The word that's actually used in Middle English is imp tree. But yeah, imp means grafted. So she falls asleep under a tree that is sort of constructed out of the parts of two different trees, right? It's one tree that has had branches from another grafted onto it. So she falls asleep in a kind of liminal space. At what time of day?
Noon.
Yeah. Between morning and afternoon, right? And in texts like this, that involve negotiations between worlds, liminal times and spaces are particularly dangerous. Because these are also places where the other world crosses over into our world, right? So when you fall asleep under a grafted tree at noon, the fairies in their world are able to see you in our world and contact you and perhaps take you, right?
So kind of taking on that fairy myth of it being like a woodland type creature? Or is that...
I think the fairies in a text like this are still closer to like what we would think of as elves, right? They're basically human in their appearance, but they live, say, like in this case, underground, right? Under a fairy hill. So they occupy a different world that's not always immediately accessible from our world, and their value sets are often unusual, right? It seems that usually they follow some code of ethics or morality, but it's not the same one that we do. They also seem to be, more powerful and more beautiful than ordinary human beings, right? So yeah, they're not really like forest fairies yet, little dancing imps on toadstools and things like that. Tolkien actually hated that kind of thing, that's something that'll come sort of more in the 17th and 18th centuries. For example, when we read on fairy stories, Tolkien will talk about the baneful influence that A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, had on the way people perceive fairies as these little winged comic creatures with little antennae and things of that nature. But yeah, that's another thing sort of to note about medieval fairies is that they're dangerous, right? They're dangerous, they're unpredictable. But they are also often susceptible, particularly to music. So if you are able to move them with music, then you have a better chance, better odds of getting your way with them. In fact, most of their interests seem to be aesthetic, right? So the king here, like his whole aesthetics seems to be a kind of aesthetic of life and death, right? He likes capturing people and keeping them frozen at this moment between life and death. And this is where I think the whole thing about the women in childbirth is particularly interesting too, right? He's capturing them not just at the moment when they would have died, right? But the moment at which they were also bringing in new life, so that potential new life is stilled along with the life of the woman giving birth.
That's a between space.
Yeah, that is absolutely that is absolutely a
A
liminal
liminal
moment.
moment.
Yeah, that is absolutely a liminal moment. Absolutely. 100%. And I think that like that, this also points to, one of the ideas that people tended to have about fairies in the fairy world, right, is that it's static, right? Whereas the mortal world is dynamic, the fairy world is static. They don't change, they don't age. They're always the same.
I sort of have one more question.
Yeah, shoot.
So the link between realms for fairies and humans is somehow at this moment, at a grafted tree, where a woman is asleep.
Yeah.
Just
Yep.
want to make that clear.
Yep. Yeah, and like again, she has all these particular risk factors, right? It's noon, and she's below a grafted tree, and so has thus made herself vulnerable to fairy influence. If she was asleep in her own home, in her own bed, like firmly within the normal human world, at the same time, no danger, right? But yeah, it's because of where she is and when that the fairies are able to grab her. And they don't grab her right away, right? They come and they say, come back tomorrow and we're going to take you.
We can either take you here or we can take you at your house, whichever one.
Yeah, they show her the vision first of where they're going to take her. And then they come back the next day to take her. Now, why do you think the poem does that? I mean, in the original Orpheus myth, Eurydice is simply bitten by a poisonous snake, and she dies. And that's it. She goes to the underworld, Orpheus goes to try to win her back. What does Orfeo try to do in order to prevent her kidnap from occurring? Let's look on page 175. Right. When all those tidings Orfeo heard, then spake he many a bitter word. Alas, I had liever lose my life than lose thee thus, my queen and wife. He counsel sought of every man, but none could find him help or plan. On the morrow when the noon drew near, in arms did Orfeo appear, and full 100 knights with him, all stoutly armed, all stern and grim. And with their queen now went that band beneath the grafted tree to stand. A serried rank on every side they made, and vowed there to abide, and die there sooner for her sake, than let men thence their lady take. And yet from midst of that array, the queen was sudden snatched away. By magic was she from them caught, and none knew whither she was brought. So what's Orfeo's response to the threat?
Armor up.
Yeah, army, right? I'm gonna take 100 knights with me to guard Eurydice beneath the tree and stop the fairies from taking her. And this is a total failure, right? Now, in the Middle English text, the word that's used to describe the knights is sheltrum. And of course, my marker is giving out here. And sheltrum is a word for what by this time was a largely obsolete tactic that had been favored by the Anglo-Saxons and other Germanic groups called the shield wall. Do you guys know what a shield wall was or what it looked like?
Just hundreds of men just having their shields up.
Yeah. Kind of like what Romans did.
They basically kind of make a box, right? And the box, as long as they hold it together, is impenetrable. Yeah, go ahead.
Until you shoot an arrow over it.
If an arrow gets through and hits somebody, then of course they fall. Right now, the other problem with the shield wall is that it is incredibly vulnerable to, say, like a cavalry charge, right? So if you've got a bunch of guys on foot with shields making a box, another thing you can do to take that box out is just charge a bunch of horses through them. This was basically how the Normans took over England. They had heavy cavalry. The Anglo-Saxons preferred infantry and these shield wall tactics. And so a lot of what's going on here, there are references to things here that are specifically Norman and specifically Anglo-Saxon. So there's some memory here of older Anglo-Saxon practices that have disappeared under Norman rule. So we'll get to some of that as well as we go through this. But did you notice anything strange about the beginning of the poem, about what we're told about Orfeo's line of descent and the city that he rules?
His father from King Pluto came, his mother from Juno, King Orfeo.
Yeah, King Pluto and King Juno.
Which is weird because Juno is inherently, it's Hera, is a female.
Yeah. So, the goddess Juno, so they're both Roman gods, right? Juno has here been regendered to be King Juno. But yeah, he's being given a classical pedigree, right? He's been given a Roman divine line of descent. What else is interesting about making him a descendant of these two gods, particularly? What's Pluto the god of?
Underworld.
Yeah, the underworld and the dead, right? Not of death per se, but he is the keeper of the dead, right? And what's Juno the goddess of?
Marriage, childbirth.
Yeah, marriage and childbirth, right? So, essentially what you've got here in his line of descent are death and life, right? And what about the city he rules here? This king abode in Thracians, a city proud of stout defense, for Winchester 'tis certain then, as Thracians was known to men. Thracians, and I don't, given the word that he uses here, I don't necessarily expect you to know this. But Orpheus, in the original Greek myth, was the king of a kingdom called Thrace, which is, I believe, something kind of like modern-day Romania, and it was culturally related to the Greeks, but wasn't actually Greek, right? The Thracians were considered by the Greeks barbarians. But yeah, Thrace, in Middle English, is Thracians. So this is part of a tradition in Middle English poetry particularly. Frequently, poets will try to make some kind of connection between Britain and the classical Mediterranean. We'll see this at the beginning of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as well. I believe that the trend starts with a poem that is actually in French by a poet called Lacomonte, called Roman de Brut, or the Romance of Brutus. And the Roman de Brut is the story of how Brutus, the last of the Trojans, makes his way to Britain and founds a dynasty there and gives his name to the island. So Sir Orfeo is playing a similar kind of game here, right? Except instead of arguing that Orfeo and his people are somehow descended from the Thracians, right? They're saying that Thrace is actually Winchester, which is in England. Right? Thrace is just an ancient name for Winchester, not a region in Eastern Europe. This is also important. Like this actually kind of goes along with the Sheltrum, the shield wall thing, in that Winchester was the West Saxon capital. So that House of Wessex we were talking about when we discussed Brunanburh and the Battle of Malden, right? The people who become the first Anglo-Saxon kings of a more or less united England. Winchester was their city; that was their capital. So, Orfeo and his people are very closely associated, then it seems, with certain features of Anglo-Saxon politics, right? So, I do want to lay out a little bit about kind of like what exactly this is and what we know about where it comes from. And this might help us with some of this materials, like just kind of figuring out what the hell is going on here, right? So, do either of you know what a romance is?
Romance.
Yeah, and I don't mean like a novel you buy at the airport with attractive models and skimpy clothes falling into each other's arms, right?
Are you talking about like a story with like chivalry and dragon fairies?
Exactly.
Pretty ladies.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, a romance is a long narrative that focuses on court culture and aristocratic adventure. And it often features things like magic, fairies, dragons, right? Supernatural happenings abound. And many of them resolve in a kind of marriage plot, right? The young, untested knight goes out, wins the hand of the fair maiden, and they marry and found a kingdom or something, right?
And that's a lot more in Sir Gawain than this one.
Yeah, Sir Gawain is a romance. The main reason we wouldn't classify Sir Orfeo as a romance is because it isn't long enough, right? Sir Orfeo is really short. So what Sir Orfeo is it's part of a related genre that we call Breton legs. Now, Breton refers to the province of Brittany in northwestern France. So if we look at, say, like a map of France, right? So let's just say that like this here is the bottom of Britain, and France is here, and there's this little peninsula that kind of juts up. That's Brittany. And Brittany has like a kind of independently developed Celtic culture. And it's closely related, the people there and the language spoken there are very closely related, in particular, to Cornwall in southwestern England. There's always been a lot of cultural exchange there. In fact, Brittany in the Middle Ages was often referred to as Less Britain, or Little Britain, because cultural ties were so strong. So the Breton, in the Breton lay, refers really only to the source of the stories. That the sources lie in Celtic legend. The language in which they're written, or at least in which the earliest ones are written, is a dialect of French called Anglo-Norman. So these are written in England, or at least in English courts. In particular, the court of the English King Henry II. Right, the earliest ones we know are written by an author named Marie de France, or who goes by the name Marie de France. We don't really know very much about her, apart from the poems that she left behind. And these date, mostly the Anglo-Norman ones anyway, from the 12th and 13th centuries. And they are essentially very brief romances in verse. Right, so, a typical romance will often focus on several different characters and intertwining plot lines. For example, a typical French romance of the 12th century will feature Arthur's nephew, Sir Gawain, adventuring sort of parallel to some other knight, like Lancelot, right? And they have kind of competing adventures until they both get to the end. And then the other knight proves himself to be slightly better. So every knight they write a romance about gets to be the greatest knight in the world by beating the greatest knight in the world, right? Lays focus on a single plot line, and they keep it relatively brief. Now, Arthurian legend is a particularly popular topic. Though there are other strands of narrative that the authors of the lays draw on. In fact, there are basically, for writers of medieval romances, particularly in France or in French-based cultures, like the Anglo-Norman culture that ruled England, there are basically three sources from which they draw their material. There's what they call the matter of Britain, the matter of France, and the matter of Rome. So the matter of Britain is Celtic myth, and especially Arthurian legend, which actually reaches its most developed and familiar form in French romances of the 12th and 13th centuries. The matter of France refers to stories of Charlemagne and his 12 peers. Right, so I don't know if any of you are familiar, like for example, with the Adventures of Roland. I mean, this might be a little bit more unfamiliar to us than the Arthur stuff. Charlemagne has never really quite caught on as a hero in British or American culture in quite the same way that King Arthur did, right?
But it was real.
Oh, he was real. Yeah, yeah. And in fact, most of the figures in the Legend of Charlemagne, in the Matter of France, are at the very least based on real people.
I think it's the way that if you look at how Arthur's described versus how Charlemagne's described, Arthur's described as this young, virile, amazing warrior king, and Charlemagne's described as an uneducated boor, essentially.
Well, actually, in the French romances, Arthur himself is largely inconsequential and doesn't do much. He's mostly just kind of like, his court is largely just a source of adventures, right? He sits there, and the knights go off and actually do everything, right? He might send them off to do something, but yeah, he's really only a catalyst or instigator of adventure, rather than he serves actually a very similar purpose to Charlemagne in the romances. Right? Charlemagne's nephew Roland is the real hero of most of the Matter of France romances. I think another reason why the Matter of France stuff has not quite caught on in popular culture is that a lot of it is about holy war stuff. French Christian knights killing Muslims and things like that, right? So it's
problematic.
It's not exactly inclusive, right? The Matter of Rome is drawn from Greek and Roman sources. So stories about Alexander the Great, stories based on Greek myths, the Trojan War, things like that. But often translated in time and space to give it a connection to Britain or to France. So we would say that Sir Orfeo is certainly built on the Matter of Rome, right? Though it does make specific references, as we've noted, to features of Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman culture. Now, this is actually a relatively late example of a lay. By the 14th century, lays are being composed in Middle English. As French, over time, ceases to be the dominant court language. It remains the dominant court language, but it becomes less universally dominant, in particular outside of the capital. Right, so in London and in the parts of France that Britain controls, that the English control, French remains the dominant court language, but some of the courts, like say in the Midlands and in northern England and in the West, begin reverting back to Middle England, back to English, or at least to this French-influenced version of English, which is a more direct ancestor of modern English than Anglo-Saxon was, as their language, not just of everyday speech, but of literature, right? In fact, when we talk about Sir Gawain, we'll talk about how there is a larger scale revival of native English verse forms in the 14th and 15th centuries. But yeah, so this poem in particular is known from 3 manuscript copies. So we're finding, like most of the Anglo-Saxon stuff we looked at, right? There's one copy of this thing that exists, right? Sir Orfeo actually exists in 3 versions that are pretty much exactly the same. There are minor differences between the 3 manuscript versions, and then there are also later adaptations of the same story, but that it's not the same poem, right? These 3 versions are substantially the same poem. Why am I looking at this? So, the oldest dates from 1330 and appears in a book that is called the Auchinleck manuscript. named after the 18th century Scottish lord in whose collection it was found. The other two books are named for the libraries that they're housed in. Harley 3810, which is circa 1400, and the latest of the three is Ashmole 61, which is dated around 1488.
I had a feeling there was going to be an Ashmole. I felt it.
And yeah, just don't say Ashmole too fast, right?
Yeah.
So what then is the earliest this poem could have been composed? Or the latest this poem could have been composed? The latest date at which it could have been composed?
1330.
Yeah. It has to have been composed before 1330, right? We don't really know exactly when, but this poem had reached a more or less complete form by the year 1330. And by 1330, as we said, English culture is beginning to assert itself a little bit more in relation to the dominant Anglo-Norman culture, right? So if we look again at some of the features of Orfeo's kingdom, right? We noted that his capital is Winchester, that his men fight in a typical Anglo-Saxon formation, and there's also a difference in his dwelling place and in the Fairy King's dwelling place, right? Where does Orfeo actually live? Where is his palace located?
King of Odin, Tracian, the city proud. He lives in Tracian.
Yeah, in Tracian/Winchester, right? So yeah, he lives in the city. That's what's important here, right? He actually lives in the city. The traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive structure was called the burgh. Which is essentially a fortified town. Right. There's no special keep or castle within the burgh. The town itself is walled and defended, and the lord lives in it with everybody else. He might have a bigger house and a great hall, but he doesn't have his own castle, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Is this where we get our word for like boroughs, like the boroughs of New York?
Yep, 5 boroughs of New York. Yeah, essentially, yeah, like a township. Yeah, it's still a borough, or even like the Auchinleck manuscript is located in Edinburgh, right? Edinburgh is an anglicized form of the Gaelic Donachan, which means Aiden's fort. So yeah, so this idea of a fortified town, still exists in lots of town and city names across the English-speaking world. The castle is a Norman import. So when the Normans invaded, they started building a different kind of defensive structure, which, if it was near a city, it was on the outskirts. Most of their castles they built out in rural areas. And the castle is designed to be separate from the town, separate from the city, right? So you've got a tower and a keep, often on a hill. If you don't have a hill already, you make one. The whole idea is to occupy high ground, because it also projects your power to the people around you, right? And then you dig a ditch around it, right? And this is called a motte and bailey structure. Right? The bailey being the tower and the keep. And the motte being the ditch that you dig around it. So Orfeo lives in town. If we look at where the Fairy King's castle is located, right, so it's underground, right, that much we know. On page 181, his beggar's cloak he on him flung, his harp upon his back he hung. With right good will his feet he sped, for stock nor stone he stayed his tread. Right into a rock the ladies rode, and in behind he fearless strode. He went into that rocky hill a good 3 miles or more until he came into a country fair, as bright as sun in summer air. Level and smooth it was and green, and hill nor valley there was seen. A castle he saw amid the land, princely and proud and lofty stand. The outer wall around it laid of shining crystal clear was made. 100 towers were raised about with cunning wrought and battled stout, and from the moat each buttress bold, and arches sprang of rich red gold. So what's important here is where the castle is. Is there any civilization around the castle?
No, it's just
Yeah.
And princely, proud, and lofty stand.
Yeah. Yeah, like a typical Norman castle, the fairy castle stands by itself in the middle of an otherwise undeveloped area. So there's one of the articles I gave you on the bibliography. It's written by a scholar named Dominique Battles. It actually goes into a lot more detail about this, right? But what Battles is basically suggesting is that what we have here is a newly assertive English majority claiming some level of cultural equivalency at the very least, perhaps even superiority, when compared to a Norman aristocracy, an alien aristocracy that's come from the other world, or well, northern France, and invaded and taken over. And I think, what's particularly interesting about that argument is what Orfeo does to win his wife back, right? He plays his harp and sings. So I think that, this is, if it's an argument about, cultural conflict, I think it is an argument in large part about cultural conflict through art and through competition in art. Now, a couple of other things to note about this, too. The whole idea of elves or fairies living underground and sort of getting there through a rock in the forest, plus the fact that, for 10 years, he tends to only see them from a distance and not really be able to contact them, right? Does that look familiar to either of you from anything you know in Tolkien?
Yeah, when they first see the elves.
Yeah.
Or actually, when the queen first sees the elves, they're all in white and glowing.
Mm-hmm. They're all in white and
Or
glowing.
when the queen
Mm-hmm.
sees the fairies,
Yeah.
they're white, glowing. The king has a crown of pure light.
Uh-huh.
We see that again both in the Hobbit books and in the movies when we
Yes.
first are introduced to them.
And if you think about the Mirkwood sequence in The Hobbit, like they keep hearing, like the dwarves keep hearing these parties, right? A little way off, and they can see a king and his revelers around him feasting, and every time they get too close, they're gone, right?
Yeah.
Until finally the elves kidnap them and take them away to their underground lair, right? So yeah, there is that direct connection here to Tolkien as well, particularly like to The Hobbit.
Talking about in Orfeo, where we first see the fairies, the way they're described, they're all in, could it also be a description of the Wild Hunt?
Can you tell me where exactly you are right now?
Let's see.
I'm going to say tentatively yes, but I want to know.
Let's see.
I want to know. I want to know exactly
They
what you're looking
spurred
for.
them back on 174.
Okay.
They spurred them back on swiftest steed, and came their king himself with speed. 100 knights with him and more, and damsels too were many a score. All riding there on snow white steeds, and white as milk were all their weeds. It's usually how the Wild Hunt's described, riding white horses dressed in white. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of them.
Yeah, and this is like also just something typical generally of medieval and early modern fairy ballads, right? You'll see the fairies riding by in procession. There's a ballad called Tam Lin. You're familiar with the story, yeah, where Tam Lin is a young knight who's been taken by the fairies, and his beloved, in order to win him back, has to not wait for the procession to ride by, jump onto his horse and tackle him, and then hold him as he turns into all of these horrible things, right? In order to free him from the fairies. Yeah, so the idea of the fairy procession and just these fairies riding in white past mortal dwellings is a very common trope. But yeah, I think there is also, if we look on page 179, right, there often by him would he see, when noon was hot on leaf and tree, the king of fairy with his rout came hunting in the woods about, with blowing far and crying dim, and barking hounds that were with him. Yet never a beast they took nor slew, and where they went he never knew. So there's a fairy hunt going on there as well, right? And if we look through these various passages of, there's the fairy hunts, there's the fairy war party, there are the fairy women going falconing, right? What we see the fairies usually doing here is imitating human activity to no real purpose. Right? They imitate, they don't create. And I think that we can relate this as well back to that whole, instead of having his artisans make statues for him, right? He kidnaps people at the moment of death and freezes them in these uncomfortable positions, right? So we see all this kind of these weird imitations of human activity, almost as though they don't really understand what the real purpose of hunting is, right? That it's not just to go riding through the woods with your hounds baying. No, you're actually supposed to catch something that you're going to eat and skin, right? But wait, not in that order. You want to skin it first and then eat it.
Yeah. I don't think you want boar bristles in your teeth.
Probably not.
Well, and then
And the pelt's probably not that much good if you've been chewing on it.
And then what I also noticed on 184, he says, I am but a wandering minstrel poor, and sir, this custom used to call at the house of many a lord to call, and little though our welcome be to offer there our minstrel. Can't even say that word.
Minstrelsy, yes.
In a way, he's invoking, like, it's not exactly guest rights, but he's invoking guest rights.
Yeah.
And then the fairy king tries to, sweep the rug out from under him. And saying, oh, no, you can't have her. She's too pretty for you. And he says, no, you said I could have whatever I want.
Yeah. And having a wandering minstrel give a bad report of you to other courts, right? That's the threat he's able to invoke in order to get what he wants, right? But I think, it's also I think you point to an important thing there, that the king's problem with Orfeo taking Herodes away is an aesthetic one, right? That you two are mismatched, right? No, she's beautiful and you're ugly. No, I can't put you together. It's too jarring, right?
Yeah, a sorry pair you'd make you two, for thou art black and rough and lean, and she is faultless, fair and clean.
Yeah. A monstrous thing then would it be to see her in thy company.
Like, you're not any better, dude.
Yeah. But everything in his kingdom is beautiful, right?
Yeah.
And so he doesn't want that jarring note of this ugly minstrel wandering around with this beautiful woman. So it's an aesthetic objection, not an objection on principles of any other recognizable sort, right?
Don't take the pretty thing away.
Yeah. or even don't pair this. It's not even don't take the pretty thing away. It's don't pair the pretty thing with the ugly thing.
See, all I can see is this fairy king going, it's aesthetic though.
Yeah.
Don't take that pretty thing away. It's aesthetically pleasing.
Yes.
It fits
And
with my
yes,
feng
don't
shui.
put it next to the hideous thing. Now there is one more thing that I want to discuss here. This is the way the poem ends. Did you notice anything weird about the ending of the poem? How does this close out?
Orfeo dies, his steward becomes king.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
And
Rewind a little bit.
He comes back to the city.
Yeah.
And he brings his queen with him, and he goes to the steward.
Mm-hmm. And then Herodes largely stops mattering after that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
She's unimportant.
Yeah.
And
She's out of the saga.
And the steward asks, "Where did you get that harp?" And he pretty
Uh-huh.
much says, "Oh, I found it next to Sir Orfeo's dead body that had been torn by lions and wolves."
Yeah.
And it's a test to see who weeps and who rejoices at his death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he tests the steward. The steward passes the test, right? And then the steward is going to get the kingdom when Orfeo dies, right? So what does that suggest about Orfeo?
He's fair. He's just.
He's fair and he's just, right? But then what else does it suggest about Orfeo and the future of his family, let's say? If we're looking at like a medieval kingship paradigm here, right? Who would be the logical heir to the throne?
His son.
Yeah, if Orfeo has any children, particularly if he has any sons, right? They should inherit. So is there anything weird here about...
There's no mention of children.
Yeah, there's no mention that Orfeo and Herodes have any children, right? Now, I remember I wrote a paper about this in graduate school that was very much focused on the notion of the grafted tree. And what do we know about the fruit of a grafted tree as opposed to the fruit of a natural tree? Do we know anything?
I would say I couldn't tell you.
The fruit of a grafted tree is usually seedless.
Sterile.
Yes. So whatever's going on, so the graft here doesn't take, right? Or requires another graft. Because the grafted tree can't reproduce. The steward becomes the next king. And there are various ways in which Herodes and Orfeo are both described as these kind of hybrid characters. Herodes has been trapped between life and death. Orfeo has been a king and a beggar, right? That these liminal figures can't reproduce. So the steward the good and faithful steward comes in as, I guess, the pinch hitter, right, when they fail to produce an heir. Now, this is what we'll finish with. Why else is the idea of in a class on Tolkien and on the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, why would a narrative about a steward be important for our purposes?
Samwise.
Well, Sam isn't really a steward.
But
he's Frodo's gardener and all-purpose right-hand man, right? Where do we see someone who's actually referred to as a steward? Yeah, we have this family of the steward of Gondor, right? Not a king, right? Very pointedly, not a king. But the most powerful noble in Gondor, right? The effective ruler of Gondor's empire, since there is no longer a king. So, what I want you to, again, to pay attention to when we get to particularly the Return of the King is the way Aragorn, who's like, and we can also draw some similarities between Aragorn and Orfeo, right? That Aragorn is a king in exile for most of his life and lives as a wild man in the wilderness, for a good portion of it. So that, there's a source of inspiration there, right? And yeah, the relationship that Aragorn in particular has with this family of stewards. All right, so since we started early, we're about at time. Do you guys have any questions about anything? Okay, great. Then let me give you the reading questions for Sir Gawain and the Green Knights. And I'll see you on Monday.